This isn't the Wild West you saw in movies. This is the version they didn't want you to know. You step into a dusty street where the boards creak even when no one's walking, and the wind keeps trying to lift your hat like it knows you don't belong here. The sun is high, unforgiving, bleaching everything until colors feel optional. Somewhere nearby, a screen door slaps shut with a sound that carries a warning more than a greeting. This is Lincoln County, New Mexico territory, and you can feel it pressing on you. Law, rumor, gunpowder, all mixed into the same stale air. You probably won't survive this if you treat it like a postcard. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where in the world people are listening from when the West refuses to stay quiet. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't meet Billy the Kid yet, not properly. First, you feel him as a disturbance, a ripple, a teenage presence moving too fast for a place already stretched thin. The mainstream historical fact everyone agrees on is simple enough. By the time he's barely past his teens, Billy has killed men, not monsters, men. That's the baseline, the unromantic starting point historians don't argue about. The arguments come later, after the body count, after the posters, after the songs. You walk past the adobe buildings and realize how young everything feels. Young towns, young grudges, young graves. Violence here isn't shocking, it's procedural. A tool, like a hammer or a shovel. The West doesn't ask if you're ready, it just checks whether you're armed. And Billy, still more boy than man, is armed in ways that go beyond the gun at his hip. He's quick, observant, and painfully good at reading rooms. He knows when someone's bluffing. He knows when to smile. He knows when to run. If this were a modern setting, you'd call it emotional intelligence. Here, it's survival software. You hear older men talk about him with a half-laugh, half-sigh tone. That kid's trouble, they say, but there's pride hiding in the warning. Trouble is useful. Trouble keeps rivals nervous. Trouble is cheaper than hiring respectability. One quirky tidbit slips into conversation almost casually. Billy is said to enjoy dancing and singing when he's relaxed, even performing Mexican folk songs learned from local families. It's an odd detail, almost tender, and it clashes violently with the image forming in your mind. You file it away, knowing it won't save anyone later. You start to sense the problem, not a villain problem, a systems problem. The territory is young, under-policed, overarmed, and emotionally feral. Courts exist in theory, jails exist in blueprint form, justice exists mostly as a rumor passed around campfires. Into this environment walks a teenager with a fast gun and a faster reputation. And instead of being corrected, he's recruited. Historians still argue whether Billy was shaped more by personal trauma or by the vacuum of authority around him. But you can feel both forces pulling at him like opposing reins on the same horse. You pause near a saloon and imagine the smell inside. Sour whiskey, sweat, tobacco, ambition. This is where reputations are traded like currency. You realize something uncomfortable. Billy isn't becoming famous because he's exceptional. He's becoming famous because he fits. He's exactly the wrong solution to exactly the wrong problem, and the West loves him for it. That's joke number one, by the way. If you ever wonder why chaos thrives, it's because chaos is punctual and order keeps missing the train. As you drift deeper into town, you hear the whispers start to sharpen. People don't say his name with fear yet. It's more like curiosity mixed with relief. "Better him than me," you catch someone mutter. That's the social contract forming in real time. Billy absorbs it. You can almost watch the moment where accountability slips off his shoulders. He's not acting out anymore. He's performing a role the environment wrote for him. Another mainstream fact slides into place. Billy is involved with older, more powerful figures during the Lincoln County War, a commercial and political conflict masquerading as frontier justice. He doesn't start the war, he doesn't control it, but he thrives in it. And thriving is often mistaken for heroism when bullets are flying. You feel the danger of that confusion settling in like dust on your boots. You take a second to imagine the modern equivalent, an unstable teenager handed a weapon and praised for solving adult problems created by greed. It sounds absurd when phrased that way, which is why history prefers ballads. Joke number 2. Legends are just bad HR decisions that outlive their paperwork. You notice how no one asks Billy to stop. They ask him to aim. They ask him to ride. They ask him to scare someone else. And every request quietly teaches him that violence isn't a failure here. It's a feature. Historians still argue whether Billy understood the long-term consequences of his actions. But standing where you stand, it's clear no one around him was interested in teaching consequences anyway. As night creeps in, lanterns flicker to life, and you feel that low hum of tension settle over the town. Billy moves through it easily, like a kid who learned early how to dodge adult expectations. There's something unsettling about how comfortable he looks. Not proud, not ashamed, just aligned. That alignment is the real problem, the one no legend likes to admit. You step back and realize this story isn't about a prodigy with a gun. It's about a society that outsourced its conscience to a teenager and then applauded when he delivered results. Joke number 3. Softly delivered so it doesn't wake anyone. When adults fail, children don't rise to the occasion. They fill the gap, and everyone pretends that's noble. The street goes quiet. Somewhere, a door closes. Somewhere else, a reputation grows legs. You don't know it yet, but you're already watching the birth of a problem that will outlive the boy himself. You keep moving because standing still in this territory feels like an invitation. The land stretches wide and flat, and it does something subtle to people. It convinces them that space equals freedom, even when everything else says otherwise. Out here, children grow up watching adults solve disagreements with rifles leaned casually against door frames. You notice how no one flinches at raised voices. The flinching comes later, when someone reaches for a belt. This is a place that eats childhood without chewing. You see it in the way boys carry themselves. Chests slightly puffed, eyes scanning for threats they can't quite name yet. Schoolhouses exist, sure, but they're optional in the same way umbrellas are optional in a sandstorm. The mainstream historical fact humming beneath your boots is that the New Mexico Territory in the 1870s had minimal, centralized law enforcement, sparse courts, and vast distances between any real authority. That vacuum doesn't stay empty for long. It fills with whoever is loudest, fastest, or most willing to pull a trigger. Billy grows up inside that gap, not metaphorically, literally. You picture him moving between towns, learning accents, learning loyalties, learning how quickly allegiances flip when money or fear enters the room. There's a quirky tidbit historians love to mention, almost as a footnote to the violence. Billy was reportedly fluent in Spanish and comfortably navigated Mexican communities that many Anglo settlers barely understood. It's framed as charm. Standing here, you recognize it as adaptation. A kid learning which doors stay unlocked if you speak the right language. You realize the territory itself rewards this kind of flexibility. Fixed morals don't travel well across deserts. Survival does. And survival teaches lessons fast. If someone cheats you and faces no consequence, cheating becomes acceptable. If someone kills and gains status, killing becomes aspirational. Historians still argue whether frontier violence reflected cultural inheritance or environmental pressure. But the ground beneath you feels like it's already voted. You pass a ranch where men argue about cattle brands like they're arguing theology. Ownership here is often decided by who can defend a claim longest, not who filed it first. That logic bleeds outward into everything else. People, towns, reputations. You think about how a boy watching this would internalize the rules. Rule 1, power answers questions faster than patience. Rule 2, hesitation is expensive. Rule 3, being dangerous keeps you fed. Billy doesn't invent these rules, he memorizes them. That's the uncomfortable part. When people later describe him as wild, untamed, or feral, it sounds poetic. It also dodges responsibility, because feral implies abandonment, and abandonment implies innocence. But you're starting to sense something sharper. This territory doesn't abandon children, it inducts them. The nights here are loud in their own quiet way. Coyotes call from the hills, and the wind drags grit along the ground like it's trying to sand down the world into something simpler. You imagine Billy lying awake, listening, learning when to sleep lightly and when to sleep not at all. Joke number 1 drifts through your mind. Bedtime stories out here are just survival tips with better pacing. You think about age for a moment, how slippery it is in historical narratives. Billy is repeatedly described as just a kid, and that's true by calendar standards, but socially, he's treated like a tool. Tools don't have ages, they have uses. Older men involve him in errands that escalate quickly. Deliver this message, watch that door, ride with us tonight. Each task nudges the line of responsibility a little farther away from the adults who should be standing there instead. Another mainstream fact settles in. Violence in the territory isn't random chaos. It's tied tightly to economic competition, especially cattle, land, and political control. The Lincoln County War doesn't erupt because people are bored. It erupts because monopolies form, rival factions arm themselves, and the absence of neutral enforcement turns business disputes into shootouts. Billy doesn't understand the balance sheets, but he understands sides, and sides are enough. Historians still argue whether Billy saw himself as a loyal friend or a paid enforcer during these conflicts. But you can almost feel how irrelevant that distinction becomes once bullets start flying. Loyalty is the story people tell themselves after survival. In the moment, it's about staying alive and staying useful. You catch yourself wondering what would have happened if someone had slowed things down, if someone had said no, if someone had treated Billy like a liability instead of an asset. The thought fades quickly, swallowed by the reality around you. This territory doesn't reward caution. joke number 2 arrives softly. Here, safety is considered a personality flaw. As dawn breaks, the land looks deceptively peaceful. Light spills across the plains, turning violence invisible for a few hours. You realize this visual calm is part of the trap. It makes everything that follows feel sudden, even though it's been building patiently all along. Billy steps into mornings like this already calibrated to danger, and that readiness makes him valuable. It also makes him terrifying. You begin to see how legends are incubated, not in moments of glory, but in long stretches of normalized dysfunction. Billy's youth becomes a talking point, a novelty, a justification. He's young, people say, as if youth excuses everything except vulnerability. No one frames it the other way, that involving a teenager in adult bloodshed is itself the original sin. Joke number 3, barely louder than the wind. When a place has no future plans, it spends its present recklessly. You look back across the territory and understand something essential. Billy isn't rising despite the environment. He's rising because of it. This land doesn't just tolerate his behavior, it refines it. By the time the name Billy the Kid starts circulating with awe instead of concern, the transformation is already complete. The problem isn't that a child learned to kill. The problem is that everyone agreed it was normal. You keep walking, because stopping now would mean admitting how preventable all of this feels in hindsight. And the West, you're learning, hates hindsight almost as much as it hates restraint. You start noticing how names behave differently out here. They don't just identify, they inflate, distort, and sometimes replace the person wearing them. William Bonney is a name that belongs to a boy who eats, sleeps, laughs, and occasionally worries. Billy the Kid, though, is something else entirely. It's lighter, faster, easier to say when you don't want to think too hard about consequences. You feel the moment when the nickname begins to outrun the human attached to it. Nicknames in the territory are earned the way scars are earned, through repetition. Say a thing often enough, and it stops sounding like a warning. You hear people testing the name in their mouths, rolling it around like a coin. Billy the Kid. There's a grin when they say it. There's comfort. A kid implies recklessness, sure, but it also implies inevitability, like a storm you don't bother blaming. This is how responsibility starts to evaporate. The mainstream historical fact anchors itself here. Billy's reputation grows rapidly through word of mouth, newspapers, and wanted posters, even though his actual actions are scattered, messy, and often reactive. He's not masterminding anything. He's responding. But response looks identical to intention. Once stories compress it into something repeatable. You can almost watch nuance collapse under the weight of a catchy name. You stand near a printing press and imagine ink hitting paper, transforming rumor into artifact. Once a name is printed, it stiffens. It becomes harder to correct, easier to exaggerate. There's a quirky tidbit historians occasionally mention with raised eyebrows. Billy was said to enjoy posing for photographs, leaning casually against props, aware of how an image could travel farther than a body ever could. It's a small thing, but it matters. He understands visibility. He understands that being seen a certain way can be a kind of armor. Historians still argue whether Billy consciously cultivated his image or simply leaned into what others projected onto him. But from where you're standing, the distinction feels thin. When a name starts paying dividends, fear, respect, protection, it's hard not to accept the deposit, especially when you're young enough to believe deposits never come due. You notice how adults begin talking about him in the abstract. Billy did this. Billy would handle that. He becomes shorthand for violence, like saying, send the weather instead of it's going to rain. That abstraction is dangerous. It lets people deploy him emotionally without confronting the fact that he bleeds, panics, and misjudges like anyone else. Joke number 1 slips in gently. Nothing dehumanizes faster than being memorable. You follow him at a distance through social spaces where reputations are negotiated. Saloons, ranch kitchens, back rooms where men lower their voices and raise their expectations. Billy is young enough to be underestimated and famous enough to be useful. It's a potent combination. You watch how adults explain things to him halfway, leaving out the parts that might inspire caution. They don't need him reflective, they need him reactive. Another mainstream fact slides into view. Many of the men Billy associates with during this period are significantly older, more established, and more insulated from legal consequences. When violence erupts, Billy is often closer to the front line. That's not bravery, that's placement. Historians still argue whether this dynamic constitutes exploitation or mutual benefit, but the imbalance is hard to miss when you're paying attention. You think about adolescence, the neurological chaos, the heightened sensitivity to reward and recognition. Out here, recognition comes fast and loud. A reputation spreads quicker than news of a harvest. Billy learns that his name opens doors and closes arguments. That lesson sticks. It becomes part of how he moves, how he stands, how quickly his hand rests near his gun, even in casual conversation. Joke number 2 hums under your breath. If you ever want to shortcut adulthood, just skip accountability and go straight to applause. The problem with nicknames is that they flatten timelines. Billy the Kid sounds like a static character, frozen in a pose, but you're watching him change in real time. Each story told about him hardens expectations. People start treating him like the thing they've heard, not the person in front of them. When he doesn't live up to the name, they push him. When he does, they cheer. You realize this is the moment where escape becomes difficult. Once your name implies violence, peace starts looking suspicious. Billy can't easily back away without disappointing someone, and disappointment in the West is often interpreted as weakness. The nickname isn't just branding, it's a behavioral trap. A fringe debate flickers here. One scholar still poke at, was Billy unusually violent for his age? Or was his age simply unusual for the violence he was expected to perform? The question hangs in the air, unresolved, like smoke after a shot. Standing here, you sense how framing alone can tilt moral judgment without changing a single fact. Joke number 3 arrives softly, almost kindly. History loves nicknames because they save space where responsibility should be. As evening settles again, you hear someone call out Billy and watch him turn instinctively. There's no pause, no recalibration. The name fits now. That's the unsettling part. William Bonney is still somewhere inside, but the territory doesn't call for him anymore. It calls for the kid. And the kid answers. You move on, carrying the uneasy understanding that once a name replaces a person, fixing the problem becomes exponentially harder. Because you're no longer dealing with a boy, you're dealing with a story that refuses to stay still. You begin to notice how killing is discussed here, not as tragedy, not even always as crime, but as leverage. Words like had to, came to it, and left no choice float through conversations the way weather reports do. Death becomes a clause in negotiations, a punctuation mark at the end of an argument. You feel the shift when violence stops being reactive and starts being transactional. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this moment is uncomfortable but clear. During the conflict surrounding the Lincoln County War, killings often functioned as strategic signals rather than emotional outbursts. They warned rivals, secured territory, and reinforced alliances. Billy doesn't invent this system. He learns it quickly. A gunshot here doesn't just remove a person, it rearranges the social map. You watch Billy move through this logic with growing fluency. Each violent act tightens his integration into adult power struggles he didn't design. He's praised not for restraint, but for effectiveness, not for wisdom, but for follow-through. You can almost hear the unspoken math running behind every interaction. Fear generated versus loyalty secured. In that equation, a teenage gunman is terrifyingly cost-effective. A quirky tidbit surfaces, passed around in half-joking tones. Some accounts suggest Billy could be oddly polite after violent encounters, apologizing for inconvenience or calmly finishing a meal afterward. It sounds surreal, almost cinematic. But politeness after violence isn't kindness. It's normalization. It signals that killing has slid into Zell realm of routine. Historians still argue whether Billy experienced remorse privately or whether constant exposure numbed him early. But standing here, you sense something more structural. Remorse requires pause. This environment doesn't allow pause. It moves too fast, demands too much, and rewards decisiveness above reflection. If Billy hesitates, someone else steps in. And stepping in is how reputations are lost. You notice how older men frame tasks carefully. They never say, kill. They say, handle, deal with, take care of. Language acts as insulation, protecting the speaker from the moral temperature of their own requests. Billy accepts these euphemisms easily. He has to. Refusing to translate them into action would make him unreliable. And unreliability is more dangerous here than brutality. Joke number one slips in, dry and understated. Nothing makes violence feel professional like a well-chosen verb. You stand at the edge of a pasture where cattle graze, oblivious to the human arithmetic happening nearby. Ownership disputes don't resolve in courtrooms. They resolve in cemeteries. Billy becomes a unit of force, deployed where persuasion has failed or feels too slow. That deployment teaches him something subtle but corrosive, that his value is proportional to the fear he inspires. Another mainstream fact settles heavily. Billy is directly involved in multiple killings connected to factional retaliation, not random barroom chaos. These deaths aren't accidents of temper. They're nodes in a broader conflict. Historians still argue whether he fully understood the political stakes of each act, but understanding stakes isn't required to pull a trigger. Understanding incentives is enough. You think about adolescence again, how identity forms around feedback. Billy's feedback loop is brutal and efficient. Violence leads to praise. Praise leads to protection. Protection leads to opportunity. Opportunity leads to more violence. It's a closed circuit with no exit ramp. Joke number two hums softly. When murder pays in social capital, inflation is inevitable. You start to feel the emotional flattening that comes with this cycle. People stop asking who died and start asking who benefits. Billy internalizes that shift. Death becomes abstract, a means rather than an end. That abstraction is the real problem, the one that legends politely ignore. A scholarly debate lingers here unresolved. Was frontier violence culturally sanctioned or merely tolerated under pressure? The distinction matters, but from where you're standing, tolerance and sanction feel indistinguishable once rewards are attached. Billy doesn't need permission, he needs approval, and he gets it. Joke number 3 arrives quietly, almost like a lullaby. When adults outsource violence, they rarely like the return policy. As night settles again, you notice how little ceremony surrounds death. No speeches, no reckonings, just movement forward. Billy walks through this world unchallenged, his actions folded neatly into the logic of survival and profit. He isn't feared because he's unpredictable. He's feared because he's reliable. You realize this is the point of no clean return. Once killing becomes social currency, redemption becomes a luxury item. Billy doesn't spend recklessly, he spends as taught. And everyone around him keeps accepting the payment even as the cost compounds. You move on with a growing certainty. This isn't a story about a boy who lost his way. It's about a society that priced violence attractively and acted surprised when someone bought in early. You feel the tempo change before anyone names it. Tension thickens, conversations shorten, and men start checking the road more often than the sky. This is the moment when private grudges stop pretending they're personal and begin calling themselves a war. The Lincoln County War doesn't announce itself with a trumpet. It seeps in through contracts, cattle counts, and whispered alliances until suddenly everyone's armed and no one remembers who fired first. The mainstream historical fact is steady and unglamorous. The Lincoln County War was a violent struggle between rival commercial factions for control of land, trade, and political power in southeastern New Mexico. It involved merchants, ranchers, hired gunmen, and lawmen whose loyalties were anything but neutral. Billy steps into this environment not as an architect, but as a tool that fits the problem frighteningly well. You watch him get pulled closer to the center, not invited, needed. Chaos has a way of promoting people quickly, and Billy's already proven he can operate under pressure. He doesn't talk strategy. He follows momentum. That's exactly what makes him valuable. Older men point him where they want fear to travel, and fear obliges. A quirky tidbit slips through the smoke. During parts of the conflict, Billy and others reportedly relied on makeshift intelligence networks. Local sympathizers, ranch hands, even children, passing messages faster than official channels ever could. It's a reminder that this war isn't formal, it's intimate. Everyone knows someone involved. Everyone's exposed. Historians still argue whether Billy understood the economic motives behind the war or simply internalized the loyalty narratives handed to him. But understanding motives isn't necessary when sides feel personal. You can feel how quickly us versus them replaces nuance. Once that happens, restraint starts looking like betrayal. You stand near a burning building and realize how symbolic the destruction feels. This war doesn't just kill people, it erases stability. Businesses collapse, families flee, neutrality becomes suspicious. Billy moves through the wreckage with an unsettling ease, as if the environment finally matches the rhythm inside him. Joke number 1 slides in. soft but sharp. Nothing accelerates adolescence like a civil war nobody admits is won. You notice how the conflict rewards visibility. Acts of violence echo louder than quiet negotiations ever could. Billy's actions ripple outward, amplifying his name, tightening expectations. Each skirmish feeds the narrative that he's essential, indispensable. That's the dangerous word. Once someone becomes indispensable, stopping them feels like sabotage. Another mainstream fact settles in. Law enforcement during the war is fragmented and partisan. Sheriffs, deputies, and judges often align with factions, turning legal authority into another weapon. Billy doesn't just fight outside the law, he fights inside its contradictions. Historians still argue whether this collapse of neutrality legitimized vigilante behavior or merely exposed existing corruption. But either way, the effect is the same. Accountability dissolves. You imagine Billy absorbing these contradictions without commentary. He doesn't need to philosophize. He needs to survive the day. And survival here means choosing a side and acting decisively. The war doesn't give him space to question whether he should be involved. It only asks whether he's willing to be effective. Joke number 2 hums through the tension. When everyone's breaking the law starts looking optional. You watch how the war sharpens Billy, not morally, operationally. He learns timing, he learns positioning, he learns how quickly rumors travel after gunfire. Each lesson reinforces the idea that violence works, and worse, that it works reliably. The environment keeps confirming the behavior it claims to fear. A scholarly debate lingers in the background, unresolved. Was the Lincoln County War a localized feud or a symptom of broader frontier instability? Standing here, you sense the answer doesn't change Billy's trajectory. Whether local or systemic, the war provides cover, justification, and momentum. It gives his actions context, and context is how violence avoids scrutiny. Joke number 3 arrives quietly, almost apologetically. Wars are just group projects where the least stable member gets the most responsibility. As the fighting drags on, you feel fatigue set in, not just physical, but ethical. Lines blur, deaths stack. People stop keeping score because the numbers stop meaning anything. Billy doesn't look triumphant, he looks practiced. That's the part history struggles with. Practice implies repetition, and repetition implies acceptance. You realize something crucial. The war doesn't need Billy to be a hero. It needs him to be consistent. And consistency, once proven, becomes expectation. By the time the conflict begins to wind down, Billy isn't just a participant. He's a symbol of how the war functioned, fast, violent, and uncorrected. You move forward with a growing unease. This war didn't create Billy, but it refined him, sharpened his edges, and removed any remaining friction between impulse and action. And when a war ends, it doesn't take its lessons with it. It leaves them behind, embedded in the people who survived. When the shooting pauses, never really stops, just pauses, you notice who's still standing close to Billy. They're not peers. They're older, steadier, better fed. Men with property, reputations, and escape routes. You feel the imbalance immediately. Billy looks like the engine, but someone else owns the map. This is where the story quietly shifts from chaos to profit. The mainstream historical fact here is subtle but crucial. Many of the influential figures surrounding Billy during and after the Lincoln County War benefit materially from the violence while remaining personally insulated from its consequences. They hold land, contracts, political connections. Billy holds a gun and a reputation. Those are not equal assets, even if they look powerful in the moment. You watch how these relationships function. No one gives Billy direct orders, not openly. They frame suggestions as loyalty tests. They couch requests in shared grievance. If they get away with this, if someone doesn't make a stand, the implication hangs heavy in the air. Billy fills it because filling it has worked before. It's not manipulation in the theatrical sense. It's alignment of incentives. A quirky tidbit slips into conversation almost unnoticed. Accounts suggest Billy was sometimes paid in small, irregular amounts, or compensated with protection and lodging rather than formal wages. It's a detail that sounds mundane, but it matters. It means he's always dependent, always a step away from exposure, always easier to use than to replace. Historians still argue whether Billy saw these men as mentors, employers, or simply allies of convenience. But standing here, you sense how little the labels matter. Power flows one direction, risk flows the other. Billy absorbs the danger so others don't have to. Joke number 1 drifts in dryly. Unpaid internships were rougher back then. You notice how these older men talk about Billy when he's not present. Their tone shifts. Less admiration, more calculation. He's useful, one says, the word landing with a dull thud. Useful isn't heroic. Useful is temporary. You feel the clock start ticking the moment that word enters the room. Another mainstream fact settles into place. As tensions cool and political arrangements stabilize, figures like Billy become liabilities rather than assets. The same volatility that once protected interests now threatens to expose them. Historians still argue whether Billy sensed this shift in time, but you can feel it in the way conversations shorten when he enters, in the way promises get vaguer. Joke number 2 murmurs through the discomfort. Nothing ages faster than yesterday's solution. Billy keeps doing what he's always done, staying visible, staying dangerous, staying necessary. But the environment is changing. The war winds down. Authorities begin reasserting themselves unevenly but persistently. Men who once hid behind Billy start looking for distance. You realize how lonely indispensability becomes once its purpose expires. You imagine Billy noticing the shift without fully understanding it. He's still young enough to trust patterns. Violence worked yesterday. Loyalty mattered yesterday. But the reward structure is changing, and no one's bothering to update him. That's not an accident. It's convenience. A scholarly debate flickers here, unresolved. Was Billy betrayed by those he served, or did he simply outlive his usefulness? The question sounds academic, but it carries moral weight. Betrayal implies expectation. Usefulness implies disposability. The territory prefers the second framing. It feels cleaner. Joke number 3 arrives softly, almost sympathetically. When the cleanup starts, nobody wants to be holding the broom. You watch Billy drift further from protection and closer to exposure. Lawmen start mentioning his name more seriously. Warrants stack. The safety net that once existed informally begins to fray. He's still feared, but fear isn't the same as shelter. Fear scatters. Shelter stays. You understand now that Billy was never meant to last. He was meant to function, and once he functioned too well, too visibly, he became inconvenient. The men who benefited from his volatility stepped back, hands clean, reputations intact. Billy is left with the one thing no one can take from him: the consequences. You move on with a tightening sense of inevitability. This isn't the fall yet. It's the moment before, when support evaporates quietly and the ground starts sloping without warning. Billy keeps walking forward, unaware that the people who once steered him have already chosen where they won't stand. When he finally stumbles, you start to notice the uniforms before you notice the men. Badges glint inconsistently, some polished, some dulled by neglect, some worn like decorations, others like disguises. Law exists here technically. It just doesn't behave the way you were promised it would. You feel the unease settle in when you realize the law isn't absent. It's selective. The mainstream historical fact grounding this stretch of road is blunt. Law enforcement in the New Mexico territory during this period was fragmented, underfunded, and often aligned with private interests. Sheriffs and deputies were sometimes appointed through political pressure rather than competence, and their authority depended heavily on which faction they answered to. You don't see impartiality here. You see uniforms picking sides. Billy moves through this landscape with a practiced skepticism. He doesn't trust badges any more than he trusts promises, sometimes less. He's seen how easily authority changes hands when money or influence speaks louder. You sense how this environment teaches a dangerous lesson. Legality is flexible, but consequences are not. If the law bends for powerful men, why shouldn't a kid with a gun do the same? A quirky tidbit surfaces in the background, often mentioned with a shrug. Billy was reportedly friendly with certain deputies at various points, sharing jokes, drinks, even information. It sounds contradictory until you remember that relationships here matter more than titles. A badge doesn't make you the law. It makes you another actor in a crowded compromise system. Historians still argue whether Billy ever genuinely believed he could be protected by aligning with specific lawmen, or whether he always understood those alliances were temporary. Standing here, you feel how tempting the illusion must have been. If the law is already compromised, maybe it can be negotiated. Maybe survival just requires knowing the right men. Joke number one drifts in lightly. When the law changes uniforms that often, it's hard to tell who's playing dress-up. You watch Billy test boundaries, small ones at first, staying too long in town, speaking too openly, letting familiarity replace caution. Each time nothing happens, the lesson reinforces itself. The system looks toothless, or friendly, or both. That's how miscalculation grows roots. Another mainstream fact presses in. Despite occasional tolerance, warrants for Billy's arrest accumulate as order slowly reasserts itself. The same institutions that once looked the other way begin to focus, unevenly but persistently. Historians still argue whether this shift represents moral awakening or simple political convenience, but the effect is undeniable. Billy's margin for error shrinks. You feel the tension when lawmen start acting less like neighbors and more like professionals, not better trained, just more determined. The jokes dry up. The warnings become formal. Billy senses it too, but he's calibrated to a different rhythm. He expects negotiation, delay, improvisation. He doesn't expect resolve. Joke number two hums quietly. The law doesn't need to be fair to be effective. It just needs to show up consistently. You notice how this inconsistency confuses Billy more than outright hostility ever could. If the law had always been firm, he might have adjusted earlier. But flexibility taught him to push. Familiarity taught him to linger. Now those lessons are being retroactively punished. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved. Did frontier lawlessness produce criminals, or merely fail to restrain them? The question hangs awkwardly in the air. Watching Billy, you sense the answer isn't binary. The system didn't create his violence, but it certainly trained it, shaped it, and then pretended it had nothing to do with the outcome. You stand near a jailhouse that looks more symbolic than secure. Thick walls, thin resolve. You imagine Billy inside it someday, not yet, but soon, and realize how unprepared everyone is for what that will mean. Locking up a legend is harder than locking up a man. Legends leak. Joke number 3 arrives softly, almost like a sigh. When authority naps, trouble sets an alarm. You move forward with the growing understanding that Billy's greatest miscalculation isn't arrogance. It's pattern recognition applied too late. He learned the rules as they were. He didn't notice when they changed. And out here, the law doesn't send memos. It sends men. As the night closes in again, you feel the air tighten. Something is aligning against him now. Not chaos, but intent. The system that once shrugged is starting to point. Billy keeps moving, still half convinced he can talk his way through it, still treating the law like another negotiable obstacle. You know better. The window's closing, and when it does, the problem everyone tolerated is about to become one they can no longer afford to ignore. You feel the shift the moment the door closes behind him. Not a dramatic slam, just the dull administrative thud of wood meeting frame. This is what passes for containment out here, a jail built more on optimism than engineering, bars that look sturdy from a distance and negotiable up close. The town exhales, briefly, as if the problem has been shelved rather than solved. The mainstream historical fact settles in cleanly. Billy is arrested and held in custody, charged with serious crimes, including the killing of a lawman. For a moment, just a moment, it looks like the system might actually assert itself. Paperwork appears. Guards are posted. People talk about due process, with a tone usually reserved for miracles. You sense the hope is fragile, but it's there. Billy doesn't panic. That's the unsettling part. He treats the cell like a waiting room. He jokes, he watches, he catalogs routines. The same skills that kept him alive on the outside now get repurposed on the inside. Historians still argue whether he planned his escape from the start or recognized the opportunity only when it presented itself. But you can feel how preparation and instinct blur once someone has practiced improvisation long enough. A quirky tidbit floats through the air, almost too neat to be true. Billy reportedly continued normal habits while jailed, eating, chatting, even flirting, projecting an ease that made guards underestimate him. It sounds like folklore until you remember how familiarity disarms vigilance. Comfort is the enemy of caution. You watch the jail's routines settle into predictability. Guards rotate, doors open, keys move from hand to belt to hook. Predictability is the crack everything slips through. Joke number 1 whispers itself in your ear. Systems fail at the speed of routine. Then it happens, not as chaos, but as sequence. A decision, a movement, a door where a door shouldn't be. The escape unfolds with brutal efficiency and it leaves bodies behind. The town jolts awake to the reality it had been postponing. The jailbreak isn't clever, it's decisive. That's why it terrifies and thrills in equal measure. The mainstream fact tightens. Billy kills 2 deputies during his escape. That's not legend, that's record. And yet, listen to the response around you. The horror competes with admiration. The outrage fights applause. People whisper about daring and audacity, about how no one else could have done it. You feel the moral center wobble. Historians still argue whether public reaction to the escape cemented Billy's legend more than any prior act. And standing here, it's hard to disagree. This is the moment the story tips from dangerous to uncontrollable. The jailbreak doesn't just free Billy, it frees the myth from restraint. When people cheer an escape like this, they're not celebrating justice avoided. They're celebrating competence displayed. Joke number 2 slides in. Uncomfortably accurate. Nothing earns applause faster than breaking rules everyone secretly doubts. You notice how quickly blame disperses. The jail was inadequate. The guards were careless. The town was unprepared. Responsibility dissolves into a fog of explanations. And Billy slips through it again, unchanged in one critical way. No one is asking whether he should be admired. They're arguing over how he did it. You think about deterrence, how it's supposed to work. Jail is meant to slow a story down, force reflection, interrupt momentum. This jailbreak does the opposite. It accelerates everything. Billy is no longer just a problem people tolerated. He's now a problem they're emotionally invested in. Some want him caught. Others want him to keep winning. Both camps feed the narrative. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved. Did the jailbreak prove the system's incompetence, or did it reveal how deeply the public desired an outlaw to succeed? The answers don't cancel each other. They stack. You can feel the stack getting heavier. You stand among townsfolk, replaying the event, each retelling sharpening details that flatter ingenuity and dull the cost. Names of the dead slip out of focus. Techniques take center stage. The violence becomes instructional, almost educational. Billy's escape starts teaching people how to feel about authority. That's when a problem becomes contagious. Joke number 3 murmurs softly, when rule-breaking becomes a performance, the audience forgets to ask who paid for the tickets. You realize how the escape seals Billy's fate even as it extends his freedom. After this, there's no quiet ending, no negotiated surrender, no soft landing. The system has been embarrassed, and embarrassed systems crave closure. The applause he hears now will curdle into urgency later. Billy rides into the open with momentum on his side and the clock against him. The guards are dead. The town is rattled. The legend is louder than ever, and for the first time, the people who once benefited from his volatility don't just step back, they disappear. You move on with a tightness in your chest, understanding that the jailbreak everyone claps for is also the moment everyone loses control of the story. From here on, every decision carries the weight of spectacle, and spectacle doesn't forgive mistakes. You feel the aftermath before you see it. A heaviness hangs over the land like sound after a gunshot that hasn't finished echoing yet. The jailbreak is over, but its consequences are just getting started. People stop talking about Billy in hypotheticals. Now they talk in numbers. Who died? Who might die next? Who's responsible? The story narrows, sharpens, and grows teeth. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this stretch is grim and unavoidable. By this point, Billy the Kid is widely believed to have killed multiple men, with estimates varying depending on which accounts you trust. The exact number is debated, inflated, deflated, argued over endlessly. But what isn't debated is the pattern. Death follows him reliably, regardless of motive or justification. You don't need a precise tally to feel the weight of it. You ride through communities where people lower their voices when his name comes up. Not out of fear exactly, but fatigue. Every killing reopens wounds that never quite healed from the last one. Revenge cycles begin overlapping. Someone's cousin, someone's friend, someone's former partner. Billy's actions don't end conflicts anymore. They multiply them. A quirky tidbit surfaces in the retellings, almost apologetic in tone. Some claim Billy spared people when he could, choosing not to kill unless cornered. It's offered as evidence of restraint, of humanity. Standing here, you realize how desperate that framing is. Sparing someone isn't virtue when violence is already the default. It's just moderation in excess. Historians still argue whether Billy's later killings were primarily acts of self-defense or preemptive strikes shaped by paranoia, but you can feel how the distinction collapses once fear becomes constant. When you expect violence, you start seeing it everywhere. And when you see it everywhere, you justify striking first. You watch how towns react. Extra locks, armed escorts, meetings that used to happen in daylight pushed into guarded back rooms. Billy's presence distorts normal life even when he's not physically there. That's the mark of a problem that's outgrown its source. Joke number one slips in quietly. When one man's reputation changes everyone's bedtime, something's gone wrong. You notice how lawmen start coordinating more deliberately now. Not better necessarily, but with intent. Warrants aren't symbolic anymore. They're actionable. Patrols widen. Messages travel faster. Billy's movements get harder to hide. He feels it too. You sense his posture change from confident to coiled. Survival mode sharpens into something harsher. Another mainstream fact presses down. Public tolerance for Billy begins to fracture. Admiration doesn't disappear, but it competes with exhaustion. People want closure. They want quiet. Historians still argue whether this shift reflects moral reckoning or simple weariness. But either way, the mood changes. Legends thrive on excitement. They suffocate in boredom and fear. Joke number two hums low. Even outlaws need good public relations. And blood is terrible branding in the long run. You think back to the beginning, to how violence once functioned as currency. Now the market's flooded. Too much supply, not enough justification. Each new death buys less loyalty, less protection. Billy's old tricks still work tactically, but strategically they're failing. The returns are diminishing. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved. Was Billy escalating because he wanted control, or because he felt it slipping away? The question hangs like smoke in still air. Standing here, you sense how easily control and fear blur when your identity depends on being dangerous. If danger fades, so do you. You watch Billy move more cautiously, sleep lighter, trust fewer people. The loneliness sets in. Not dramatic, not poetic, just practical. Safe places shrink. Friendly faces thin out. Even sympathy starts sounding like risk. Joke number three arrives softly, almost kindly. When everyone knows your name, nobody knows where to hide you. You realize this is the phase legends rarely linger on. The part where nothing glamorous happens. Just constant tension, constant movement, constant readiness. No songs get written about exhaustion. No posters celebrate paranoia. But this is where the cost finally becomes personal. Billy keeps writing, keeps reacting, keeps doing what once worked because it's all he knows how to do. The problem isn't that he's cruel, it's that he's consistent in a world that's decided it wants consistency to stop. You move forward with the understanding that the body count isn't just a statistic, it's a signal. And the signal is getting louder. This can't continue, not because it's immoral, though it is, but because it's destabilizing. The West can tolerate violence. It can't tolerate endless uncertainty. Somewhere ahead, the road narrows. Options thin. The legend is still alive, but the space around it is closing in. And for the first time, you sense that Billy isn't outrunning the problem anymore. He is the problem. You meet him at the edge of inevitability, the man tasked with doing what no one else wants credit for. Pat Garrett doesn't arrive like a hero. He arrives like paperwork, necessary, dull, and resented. You feel the mood shift when his name starts circulating with intent rather than gossip. This isn't another deputy looking for a headline. This is someone sent to end a disturbance, not debate it. The mainstream historical fact settles in with uncomfortable clarity. Pat Garrett is appointed sheriff with the explicit goal of capturing Billy the Kid, not negotiating, not delaying, ending the problem. You can feel how different that mandate is from everything that came before. The law, fragmented and selective as it's been, finally focuses. And focus changes the temperature of a pursuit. You watch Garrett move through towns with a steadiness that doesn't ask for applause. He listens more than he talks. He doesn't romanticize the chase. He treats it like pest control, methodical, unglamorous, and best done quietly. People don't know how to react to that. They want drama. He brings logistics. A quirky tidbit floats through the background, almost whispered. Garrett and Billy knew each other before this. Shared space, shared conversations, even shared a kind of mutual recognition. It complicates the narrative in ways ballads hate. This isn't good versus evil. It's familiarity turned procedural. Historians still argue whether Garrett's prior acquaintance with Billy made the hunt more personal or more professional. But standing here, you sense it stripped away illusions on both sides. Joke number one slips in softly. Nothing kills romance faster than someone who reads the instructions. You feel the pressure close as Garrett begins narrowing options instead of chasing rumors. He studies routes. He predicts habits. He waits. Billy has spent years outrunning chaos. Garrett doesn't chase chaos. He sidesteps it. That's the difference. The pursuit becomes asymmetrical. One side thrives on improvisation. The other thrives on patience. Another mainstream fact anchors the moment. Garrett's strategy isn't a dramatic showdown. It's attrition. He pressures associates, cuts off shelter, disrupts routines. Historians still argue whether this approach reflects evolving law enforcement professionalism or simple pragmatism, but either way, it works. Billy's world contracts. The map loses friendly margins. You notice how people react to Garrett differently than to Billy. There's no cheering, no whispering awe, just relief mixed with resentment. Ending a problem feels necessary, but it's rarely celebrated by those who benefited from the noise. Joke number two hums quietly. The cleanup crew never gets applause, just complaints about the mess. You imagine Billy sensing the change without fully naming it. He's used to lawmen who posture, who negotiate, who blink. Garrett doesn't blink. He waits. That unnerves Billy more than threats ever could. Threats imply engagement. Waiting implies inevitability. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved. Was Garrett a hero restoring order, or simply another man enforcing a system that created Billy in the first place? The question hangs in the air, heavy and unresolved. You feel how tempting it is to pick sides, to simplify, but simplification is what got everyone here. You stand near a campfire where men speak in half sentences. Plans are shared cautiously now. Names are omitted. Billy's allies thin out, not through betrayal, but through survival math. Helping him has become too expensive. The cost-benefit analysis finally flips. Billy feels it. You can see it in the way he stops lingering, stops trusting, stops sleeping deeply. Joke number 3 arrives gently, almost sympathetic. When fear becomes inconvenient, loyalty checks out early. You realize how lonely inevitability is. Garrett doesn't taunt. He doesn't issue dramatic proclamations. He just keeps moving forward, compressing space, reducing choices. Billy's legend, once expansive, now works against him. Everyone knows his habits. Everyone expects his moves. Predictability becomes a cage. The pursuit strips Billy of the one thing that sustained him, momentum. Every pause costs him. Every decision feels heavier. He's not just running from a man, he's running from a system that's finally decided to function. Not fairly, not cleanly, just decisively. You feel the air tighten as winter approaches, literal and figurative. Cold makes hiding harder. Hunger makes mistakes louder. Garrett doesn't rush this. He understands time as a weapon. Historians still argue whether Garrett intended to capture Billy alive or expected the pursuit to end violently, but expectation matters less than preparation. And Garrett is prepared. You stand back and see the symmetry resolve. Billy thrived in disorder. Garrett thrives in closure. One is reactive, the other terminal. This isn't a duel of skills so much as a collision of philosophies. The West tolerated Billy because he was useful in chaos. It empowers Garrett because chaos has become costly. As the distance closes, you sense the story shedding excess. Side characters fade. Motivations simplify. What's left is a narrowing corridor where improvisation loses ground to intent. Billy keeps moving because stopping feels like surrender. Garrett keeps waiting because waiting feels like victory. You move on with the understanding that this hunt isn't about revenge or justice. It's about resolution. The West wants the noise to stop. And when the West wants quiet, it hires someone who doesn't need to be liked. The end is approaching, not with drama, but with certainty. And certainty, you're learning, is far more dangerous than fear. You feel the stillness before it happens, the kind that presses on your ears until your own breathing sounds suspiciously loud. This is where history slows everything down, not out of respect, but because it wants to argue later. The room is dim, the air is heavy, and the distance between decision and consequence has collapsed to almost nothing. The mainstream historical fact sits at the center of this moment, unavoidable and endlessly debated. Pat Garrett shoots Billy the Kid, killing him. That much is stable. Everything wrapped around it, timing, dialogue, intent, shifts depending on who's telling the story and why. You stand in the uncertainty and feel how quickly facts dissolve once they're exposed to emotion. Billy doesn't die in a blaze of spectacle. He dies in a small space, caught between recognition and reaction. There's no crowd to cheer or boo, no slow-motion heroics, just a decision made faster than regret can form. Historians still argue whether Billy recognized Garrett in time, whether he spoke first, whether he reached for a weapon. The arguments persist because the ambiguity is useful. Ambiguity gives everyone something to defend. You notice how quickly the narrative fractures. Some describe the killing as necessary, inevitable, overdue. Others frame it as betrayal, ambush, injustice. The same event supports entirely different moral conclusions depending on where you stand. That's the danger of legends. They turn endings into mirrors. A quirky tidbit slips into the retellings, almost cinematic in its persistence. The idea that Billy's last words were spoken calmly, even casually. Whether true or not, the detail sticks because it humanizes him at the exact moment people need him, either sanctified or condemned. Calm last words suggest acceptance, or courage, or narrative convenience. You can't tell which, and that's the point. Joke number 1 arrives softly, almost apologetic. History loves last words because they save us from admitting we don't know what people think when they die. You feel Garrett's position in this moment, isolated, practical, instantly controversial. He doesn't get a victory lap. He gets suspicion, resentment, and second-guessing. Killing a problem is rarely as satisfying as solving one, especially when the problem has fans. Garrett does his job and immediately becomes a symbol people argue over instead of listen to. Historians still argue whether Garrett acted out of duty, fear, or preemptive survival. But standing here, you sense how little that matters once the trigger is pulled. Another mainstream fact settles in. Billy is 21 years old. That number lands heavier than any bullet. 21, barely past adolescence, old enough to be dangerous, young enough to be unfinished. The West doesn't pause to process that contradiction. It just moves on to the argument. You notice how quickly the body disappears from focus. Attention jumps to motives, to methods, to legality. Death becomes administrative. That's how the myth survives. By shifting away from the corpse, people preserve the story. Joke number 2 hums quietly. Nothing keeps a legend alive like changing the subject. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved and endlessly recycled. Was Billy the Kid murdered, or was he lawfully killed in the line of duty? The language alone does the work. Murder implies moral failure. Lawful killing implies closure. The choice of words reveals more about the speaker than the event. You feel the debate stretching forward in time, generation after generation, because it lets people argue about values without confronting systems. You step back and see the broader picture snap into focus. Billy dies not because he's the most violent man in the West, but because he's become the most inconvenient. His unpredictability, once useful, is now destabilizing. Garrett doesn't end a legend. He interrupts a feedback loop. The applause and outrage that follow prove how necessary that interruption was and how uncomfortable. Joke number 3 arrives gently, almost tired. When everyone argues about how something ended, it's usually because they didn't like how it began. You feel the aftermath settle in waves. Some towns breathe easier. Others feel robbed of excitement. Ballads begin forming almost immediately, sanding off the rough edges, polishing motives, simplifying choices. Billy becomes younger, braver, purer in death than he ever was alive. Garrett becomes colder, harsher, flatter, Complexity is expensive. Stories prefer discounts. You think about inevitability again. Was this always going to end this way? Historians still argue whether alternative paths existed: capture, exile, disappearance. But inevitability is easier to swallow than responsibility. If it had to happen, then no one failed. Standing here, you sense how comforting that belief is. The room empties. The night moves on. Life resumes with remarkable efficiency. That's what endings look like in reality. Not climactic, just final. The West doesn't mourn long. It repurposes quickly. Billy's death becomes content, a reference point, a template. You realize something unsettling as you step away. The killing doesn't resolve the argument. It starts it. From here on, Billy will be safer than he ever was alive, protected by distance and interpretation. He can't contradict anyone now. He can't complicate the narrative. He's finally manageable. And that, more than anything else, tells you why the debate never ends. You notice the machines start up almost immediately. Not literal ones, those come later, but the social machinery that turns messy endings into something palatable. Newspapers sharpen their pencils. Storytellers clear their throats. Memory begins its quiet work of editing. Billy is dead, which makes him safe. Safe to admire, safe to reshape. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this stage is straightforward. Newspapers across the region and beyond report Billy's death with wildly different tones, from triumphant to mournful to sensational. Facts appear alongside speculation, and speculation travels faster. You can feel how quickly distance softens edges. A killing that felt abrupt and unsettling in the room becomes dramatic and inevitable on the page. You watch the language change. Billy isn't described as unstable or inconvenient anymore. He's notorious, then famous, then legendary. Each word adds polish. Each word subtracts context. The violence remains, but it's reframed as daring. Consequences fade behind charisma. You realize how quickly the public learns to enjoy a story more once it can't hurt anyone new. A quirky tidbit floats into circulation, repeated with growing confidence. Exaggerated claims about Billy's kill count, numbers swelling far beyond anything provable. The inflation isn't accidental. Bigger numbers make better copy. Bigger numbers make the outlaw larger than life. Historians still argue how many men Billy actually killed, but the argument itself becomes part of the entertainment. Accuracy loses to impact. Joke number one slips in quietly. Truth is expensive to print, but exaggeration travels first class. You feel how the narrative tilts sympathy toward Billy by shifting focus to his youth, his charm, his cleverness. These details were always there, but now they're foregrounded, rearranged to suggest tragedy rather than trajectory. The system that shaped him recedes into the background. It's easier to mourn a boy than interrogate a society. Another mainstream fact presses gently but firmly. Ballads and folk songs about Billy the Kid begin circulating soon after his death, spreading far beyond New Mexico. Music carries emotion faster than explanation. Once a story is sung, it resists correction. Historians still argue whether these songs reflected popular sentiment or actively created it. But standing here, you can feel how melody smooths moral friction. You notice what's missing. The names of the dead fade first, then their reasons, then their families. Billy remains because he's the most narratively efficient character. One face, one name, one arc. Joke number 2 hums softly. History prefers protagonists who don't argue back. You think about Pat Garrett's place in all this. He doesn't fare as well in the retelling. Complexity doesn't suit a story that wants a clean villain. Garrett becomes cold, calculating, sometimes cowardly, depending on who's singing. The fact that he represents closure rather than excitement makes him easy to flatten. Historians still argue whether Garrett was unfairly maligned by popular culture, but you sense how predictable that outcome was. Endings rarely win fan clubs. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved and quietly revealing. Does myth-making serve as cultural processing, or is it a form of avoidance? The question doesn't settle. It doesn't need to. The machinery keeps running regardless. Joke number 3 arrives with a tired smile. If reality were more entertaining, legends would be out of work. You step back and see how the transformation completes itself. Billy is no longer a problem to be managed. He's a symbol to be consumed. That shift changes everything. Symbols don't destabilize towns. They decorate them. They sell papers. They fill evenings. The danger is gone, replaced by nostalgia. You feel the irony settle in. The West couldn't tolerate Billy alive, but it can't get enough of him dead. The violence that demanded resolution becomes flavoring in the story. People argue passionately about what Billy represented while ignoring what he actually did. That's how myths keep their shine. You move forward with a quiet understanding. This stage isn't about lying. It's about selecting. Selecting which details feel comfortable, which feel exciting, and which are quietly dropped along the road. The myth doesn't erase the truth. It rearranges it until it stops asking uncomfortable questions. And somewhere inside that rearrangement, the original problem disappears entirely, replaced by something much easier to love. You start to see the seams where danger gets repackaged, not removed, just wrapped more attractively. Billy's face appears on posters and pamphlets and stories told by people who never had to lock their doors because of him. The outlaw becomes a logo, and logos don't make anyone nervous. They make people nostalgic. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this phase is uncomfortable in its familiarity. Billy the Kid becomes a commercial and cultural product. His name is used to sell books, plays, later films, and souvenirs. The specifics vary, but the direction doesn't. Violence is distilled into personality. Consequence is swapped for charm. You can feel the transaction complete itself. You notice how the language shifts again. Billy isn't framed as a destabilizing force anymore. He's framed as a rebel. Rebellion sounds principled, even when it isn't. It suggests purpose where there was mostly momentum. Historians still argue whether Billy's actions can be meaningfully interpreted as resistance to authority. But the debate itself helps the brand. Resistance sells better than recklessness. A quirky tidbit surfaces, almost comically revealing. Some early portrayals depict Billy as taller, handsomer, and more composed than contemporary descriptions suggest. It's a small exaggeration with big implications. Image doesn't just enhance the story, it replaces it. The boy who survived through volatility becomes a man who stands for something tidy. Joke number 1 drifts in with a knowing sigh. Once danger gets merchandised, it stops being dangerous to the buyer. You watch how complexity gets filtered out. The economic interests, the adult manipulators, the institutional failures. none of these make for a clean narrative hook, so they fade. What remains is a lone figure with a gun and a grin, facing down an abstract idea called the law. That framing flatters everyone who consumes it. It turns systemic mess into personal drama. Another mainstream fact presses in. By the early 20th century, Billy's story is increasingly told through romanticized fiction rather than historical accounts. Historians still argue whether popular culture merely reflects public appetite or actively shapes it. But standing here, you can feel how appetite gets trained. Repetition does the work. Familiar beats replace difficult questions. You notice the irony deepen, the very traits that made Billy intolerable alive, unpredictability, volatility, refusal to settle, become virtues once he's safely fixed in time. Death freezes him at his most photogenic angle. No aging, no regrets, no escalation. Joke number 2 hums softly, immortality is easiest when you die young and loud. You think about brands for a moment, how they function. A brand simplifies choice. It tells you how to feel before you've asked why. Billy the Kid, the brand, tells you to feel thrilled, sympathetic, impressed. It does not ask you to consider the towns that wanted quiet more than excitement, or the families who wanted routine more than stories. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved and increasingly awkward. Can a violent figure be separated from the violence that made them famous? The question gets asked politely and answered selectively. The brand prefers separation. It's cleaner, less morally expensive. Joke number 3 arrives lightly, almost kindly. If the past were judged like products, most of it would come with warning labels no one reads. You watch how future outlaws are measured against Billy's image. He becomes a template, a benchmark, not for behavior, but for aesthetics. Style matters more than impact. Charisma outweighs cost. That's how the problem replicates itself culturally, long after the original threat is gone. You realize this is the final stage of transformation. Billy is no longer a historical figure to be understood or critiqued. He's a shorthand, a mood, a reference people invoke without context. The messiness that once demanded resolution now fuels entertainment. You step back and feel the unease settle in fully. Turning a problem into a brand doesn't just misremember the past, it trains the future. It teaches people what kinds of chaos are forgivable, even admirable, if packaged well enough. And in that lesson, the West leaves behind something far more enduring than a legend. It leaves behind permission. You arrive at the part of the story people usually skip past quickly because it's uncomfortable to linger where admiration starts to look like complicity. You stand among the graves that never made the songs, the families whose names didn't survive the retellings. This is where the ledger opens and the numbers stop being abstract. The mainstream historical fact grounding this moment is stark. Frontier violence wasn't exceptional, it was systemic. Billy's actions didn't occur in isolation. They fit into a broader pattern where disputes were settled by force because institutions were weak, biased, or absent. That context matters, but it doesn't absolve. It explains how something became possible, not why it should be celebrated. You start noticing how legends quietly require casualties. Not just the obvious ones, the men who died, but the secondary losses. Towns that never stabilized, businesses that never reopened, families that learned to expect disruption as a permanent condition. Billy's story survives because it's singular. The costs don't because they're distributed. That's how legends win the accounting game. A quirky tidbit floats up from the margins often overlooked. Some contemporaries described Lincoln County as noticeably calmer after Billy's death. Not better, not just calmer. It's an unromantic word, and that's why it rarely gets quoted. Calm doesn't sell, but calm is what communities crave when adrenaline stops being entertaining. Historians still argue whether Billy's removal actually reduced violence long-term or merely shifted its shape. But standing here, you sense a quieter truth. Stability doesn't require perfection. It requires predictability. Billy's presence, mythic or not, eroded predictability. That erosion is the problem legends politely ignore. You watch how admiration reframes harm. Deaths become part of the times. Fear becomes frontier grit. Instability becomes freedom. Language does the laundering. Joke number one slips in with a weary smile. If you rename a mess often enough, someone will eventually call it decor. You think about how societies choose their symbols. They don't pick the most ethical figures, they pick the most memorable. Billy is memorable because he's volatile, young, and photogenic in hindsight. The people who paid the price for that volatility are forgettable because they were ordinary. Ordinary losses don't anchor myths. Another mainstream fact presses gently but insistently. Many communities in the territory actively sought stronger law enforcement and institutional order after periods of intense violence. That desire contradicts the romantic image of a West allergic to rules. Historians still argue whether this reflects hypocrisy or maturation, but you can feel the relief in it. People don't tire of justice. They tire of chaos. Joke number two hums quietly. Nobody misses the party once the cleanup takes longer than the fun. You notice how the legend teaches a subtle lesson backward in time. It suggests that violence earns meaning, that disruption is a prerequisite for significance. That's the most dangerous inheritance. Not the facts, but the implication. If enough people internalize that lesson, problems don't just repeat, they escalate. A scholarly debate lingers here, unresolved and uncomfortable. Does glorifying frontier outlaws distort public tolerance for violence in the present? The question never quite lands because it asks too much of nostalgia. Nostalgia prefers the glow, not the heat. You step closer to the edge of the argument and realize something that doesn't fit cleanly anywhere else. Billy wasn't uniquely evil. He wasn't uniquely brave. He was uniquely enabled. That's harder to sing about. It requires admitting that adults made choices that turned a volatile teenager into a fulcrum for conflict. Legends don't like shared blame. Joke number three arrives softly, almost as a confession. It's easier to idolize a ghost than confront a system. You watch how responsibility gets redistributed in the telling. The system fades. The audience absolves itself. The past becomes a stage where mistakes feel safely contained. But the lesson leaks forward anyway, teaching new generations how to misread risk as romance. You think back to the nickname, how it replaced the person. That replacement didn't just simplify Billy, it simplified the West. It allowed people to believe problems arrive fully formed, wearing hats and carrying guns, rather than emerging slowly from neglect and incentives. That belief is convenient. It's also wrong. Standing here, you understand why this chapter matters. Not to condemn Billy again or to rehabilitate him, but to reclaim proportion. He wasn't the West's soul. He was a symptom. Treating symptoms as icons doesn't cure anything. It just teaches people to ignore the fever. You take one last look at the landscape and feel the weight settle. Legends need corpses, not just to begin, but to stay uncomplicated. The more bodies fade from view, the easier the story becomes. And the easier the story becomes, the more likely it is to be repeated without thought. You move on with a quiet certainty. Admiration isn't neutral. It has consequences. And when societies choose their legends poorly, they don't just misremember the past. They miseducate the future. You reach the end of the road where stories usually stop pretending they're neutral. There's no marker here, no sign announcing significance, just a quiet realization settling in your chest. Billy the Kid didn't become a legend because he solved anything. He became one because no one solved him in time. The mainstream historical fact anchoring this final stretch is simple and unsettling. Billy's death did not end violence in the West, nor did it magically purify frontier justice. What it did end was a specific instability, a roaming variable that institutions, factions, and communities had failed to regulate. His removal wasn't a moral victory, it was a logistical one. You look back across everything you've walked through, the war, the alliances, the law that bent until it snapped into focus. Billy wasn't steering history. He was being carried by it, then crushed when the current shifted. That doesn't make him innocent. It makes him illustrative. He's a case study in what happens when a society confuses usefulness with value. A quirky tidbit lingers at the edge of the narrative, rarely emphasized. After Billy's death, many of the men who once orbited him slipped quietly into obscurity or respectability. Businesses resumed. Politics normalized. Life went on. The system corrected itself not by reflection, but by subtraction. Billy was removed, and the discomfort dissipated just enough for everyone to move forward without apologies. Historians still argue whether Billy should be remembered primarily as a criminal, a victim of circumstance, or a folk hero born of narrative excess. But standing here, you realize those categories are distractions. They keep the focus on the individual instead of the conditions that elevated him. The argument survives because it's safer than asking who benefited while the problem was active. Joke number one drifts in, subdued and tired. When a system works again, it rarely sends thank you notes to the damage it caused. You think about how easily the phrase, "that's just how it was back then," gets used as a blanket. It sounds explanatory, but it's often a dodge. Every era has norms. Every era also has choices. The West chose speed over structure, fear over patience, and short-term advantage over long-term stability. Billy didn't challenge those choices. He embodied them. Another mainstream fact presses in gently. Communities in the region increasingly pushed for courts, railroads, schools, and standardized law as the frontier closed. Order wasn't imposed from above alone. It was demanded from below. That demand doesn't fit well with the myth of a West that loved chaos. Historians still argue whether this shift represented progress or loss. But from where you're standing, it looks like exhaustion, finally finding a voice. Joke number two hums softly. People don't romanticize disorder once they have to raise children in it. You realize this is the quiet truth at the heart of the story. Billy wasn't a legend because he was exceptional. He was a legend because he was unsustainable. The system could absorb him for a while, even enjoy him, but eventually he exceeded tolerance thresholds. That's when stories step in to soften what reality had to correct. A scholarly debate lingers one last time, unresolved but revealing. Are legends cautionary tales or permission slips? The answer depends on how carefully they're told. Strip away context, and you get permission. Restore it, and you get warning. Joke number 3 arrives gently, almost as a lullaby. History doesn't repeat, it hums, and some people dance to the wrong tune. You take a breath and let the narrative settle where it belongs. Billy the Kid wasn't the West's spirit. He was a malfunction in its wiring, a problem misdiagnosed as personality. Once you see that, the shine dulls just enough to make room for understanding. You don't leave with a hero or a villain. You leave with a pattern. How societies elevate volatility when it's useful, how they mythologize it when it's gone, and how easily they forget the cost while replaying the highlight reel. That's the real lesson waiting here. Not about Billy, but about us. About how often we confuse excitement for meaning and momentum for purpose. About how problems become stories once they're safely over. Wind down. 300 words. Now the noise finally fades. The gunshots you've been carrying loosen their grip, dissolving into the low, steady hush of wind moving through empty plains. You let your shoulders drop. There's no chase left, no argument to win tonight. You picture the land as it is after everyone's gone. Roads cooling, dust settling, lanterns blown out one by one. The West exhales when no one is performing anymore. It always does. History only feels loud when we keep replaying it. You remind yourself that understanding doesn't require admiration, and clarity doesn't demand cruelty. Billy the Kid can be young, shaped, tragic, and still a problem that needed ending. Those truths don't cancel each other. They coexist, quietly, like stars you only notice once your eyes adjust. Your breathing slows. The edges of the story soften. Names lose their urgency. What remains is a gentle awareness of how easily myths form and how careful you have to be not to fall asleep inside them. There's comfort in recognizing patterns without becoming captive to them. Comfort in knowing you can listen, learn, and still choose differently when it's your turn to decide what deserves applause. The land goes dark now, not ominously, just naturally. Crickets take over. Somewhere far away, a train horn hums like a reminder that time kept moving even when stories froze. You're safe here. No one's chasing you. No one's asking you to pick a side. You can let the past be the past without polishing it or fearing it. So let the quiet do its work. Let the legend rest where it belongs. Understanding, not worship.